I never imagined that love could begin in a prison of stone, nor that my own hands, rough from years of scrubbing floors and carrying water, would be the ones to set free the most powerful man in all of Ashworth. But fate, I have learned, cares nothing for rank or reason, and the heart knows no boundaries that society has not already tried to build. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after, moments so profound that they reshape the very landscape of your soul. The night I climbed that tower was such a moment for me. Everything I had been before that climb, every fear and doubt and limitation I had accepted as my lot in life, fell away like dead leaves in autumn. And everything I became afterward, every joy and triumph and heartache, grew from the seeds planted in that darkness. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the end, you must first understand the beginning. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I was born in the shadow of Ashworth Manor, in a cottage so small that the wind seemed to pass through its walls as easily as through the branches of the oak trees that surrounded it. My mother died when I was still young enough to believe that tears could bring the dead back to life, and my father followed her not 3 winters later, his body broken by labor and his spirit extinguished by grief. I was left alone in a world that had little use for orphaned girls with no fortune and no family name to speak of. I remember the sound of my father's last breath. I remember the way the cottage felt afterward, empty in a way that went beyond the absence of bodies. It was as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the walls, leaving only cold stone and memories that cut like glass. I sold what little we had, a few pieces of furniture, my mother's wedding ring, my father's tools, and I lived on the proceeds for as long as I could. But money runs out, especially when you are too young to earn more, and soon I found myself with nothing but the dress on my back and a hunger that gnawed at my belly like a living thing. I tried to find work. I went to every farm and every shop in the village, offering my services for whatever wages they would pay. But times were hard for everyone, and no one had room for another mouth to feed. I was turned away again and again, until the humiliation of begging began to feel as familiar as breathing. I remember the day I nearly died. I was 17 years old, and I had not eaten in 4 days. The village had turned me away, for there was no work to be had, and charity was a luxury that none could afford in those lean months following the failed harvest. I walked to the gates of Ashworth Manor because I had heard that the kitchen sometimes gave scraps to beggars, and I was desperate enough to beg. But I never reached the kitchen door. My legs gave way beneath me in the garden, among the roses that the late Duchess had planted years before, and I fell upon the gravel path like a leaf torn from its branch by an autumn wind. I remember the sky above me, pale and indifferent, and I remember thinking that it would not be so terrible to die among flowers. I did not die. I woke in a bed that smelled of lavender and clean linen, with a fire burning in the hearth, and a woman I did not know pressing a cool cloth to my forehead. The sensation was so foreign, so unexpectedly gentle, that for a moment I thought I must have died after all, and awakened in some kinder afterlife. "Where am I?" I asked, and my voice came out as a croak, barely recognizable as my own. The woman, who I would later learn was the head housemaid, smiled down at me with an expression of genuine concern. "You are at Ashworth Manor, child. You collapsed in the garden and gave us all quite a fright." She told me that the young Duke himself had found me among the roses, that he had been walking in the garden in the early morning, as was his habit, when he had come upon my crumpled form lying on the gravel path. She told me that he had knelt beside me and checked for breath, and that when he found that I was still alive, he had gathered me in his arms as if I weighed nothing at all and carried me inside. She told me that he had shouted for the servants, that he had demanded a physician be sent for immediately, that he had stood in the doorway of this very room until he was assured that I would survive. She told me that he had visited twice while I slept, asking after my condition with a concern that surprised everyone who knew him. The Duke was not known for his warmth, she explained. He was respected, certainly. He was admired for his intelligence and his fairness, but he kept his distance from everyone, even those who had served his family for decades. For him to take such an interest in a stranger, A ragged beggar girl found half dead in his garden was unprecedented. I lay there in that soft bed, surrounded by more comfort than I had ever known, and I tried to understand what had happened to me. I had gone to the manor, expecting nothing more than scraps from the kitchen. Instead, I had been given a second chance at life. The contrast was so stark, so overwhelming, that I could not fully absorb it. I did not meet him until 3 days later, when I was strong enough to stand and walk and remember my manners. The physician had come and gone, pronouncing me malnourished but otherwise sound. The servants had brought me food and clean clothes, had helped me bathe and brush my tangled hair. I was still thin and pale, still weak from my ordeal, but I was alive. I was alive, and I owed that life to a man I had never met. He came to the servants' quarters where I had been given a small room, and he stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed upon my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 25 years of age, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the moors. He was tall and lean, with the bearing of a man who had been taught from birth that the world was his to command. But there was something else in his face, something I could not name then, but would come to know well in the years that followed. It was loneliness, I think now. A loneliness so deep and so carefully hidden that it had become invisible to everyone but me. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, studying me with those storm cloud eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle that I had unknowingly presented. I felt myself flush under his gaze, suddenly aware of how I must look to him. A scrawny girl in borrowed clothes, her hair still limp despite the careful brushing, her face still hollow from weeks of hunger. I wanted to apologize for my appearance, for my intrusion, for the trouble I had caused. But something in his expression stopped me. He asked my name, and I told him. "Clara Whitmore," I said, and my voice trembled only slightly. He asked where I came from, and I told him that too, describing the cottage near the village, the death of my parents, the slow descent into destitution that had brought me to his garden. He listened without interrupting, his face betraying nothing of what he thought or felt. He asked if I had anyone in the world who might care what became of me, and when I shook my head, he nodded as if my answer had confirmed something he already suspected. There was a long silence then, during which I tried to read his expression and failed. His face was a mask, carefully neutral, revealing nothing. I wondered if he was trying to decide what to do with me. I wondered if I would be sent back to the village, back to the slow death by starvation that had nearly claimed me already. The thought filled me with a despair so profound that I had to grip the edge of the bed to keep from swaying. But when he spoke, his words were not what I expected. "You will stay here," he said. It was not a question, nor was it precisely a command. It was something in between, an offer wrapped in the authority of his station. "You will work in the household, and you will be given wages and a place to sleep and food enough to eat. Is this acceptable to you?" I stared at him, not quite believing what I had heard. I searched his face for some sign of mockery or cruelty, some indication that this was a joke at my expense. But I found only that same neutral expression, tempered now by something that might have been kindness, or might have been simple practicality. I said yes, because there was nothing else I could say, and because I was grateful, and because something in his voice told me that he needed my acceptance as much as I needed his generosity. I do not know how I knew this. Perhaps it was the slight tension in his shoulders, or the way his hands tightened almost imperceptibly behind his back. Perhaps it was something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that appeared and vanished so quickly I might have imagined it. Whatever it was, it made me understand that this was not merely an act of charity. It was something more, something I could not yet define. That was how I came to live at Ashworth Manor, and that was how I first met Lord Sebastian Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, the man who saved my life without knowing that one day I would save his in return. 5 years passed, and in that time I learned every corner of the great house, every creaking floorboard and drafty corridor, every secret staircase and forgotten room. I learned the rhythms of the household, the hierarchies among the servants, the gossip that traveled from the scullery to the drawing room and back again. I rose from the lowest position to become one of the senior housemaids, trusted with the care of the finest rooms and the most delicate tasks. I learned how to polish silver until it gleamed like moonlight. I learned how to fold linens with military precision. I learned how to move through the grand halls without being seen or heard, how to anticipate the needs of the family before they were spoken, how to be useful without being intrusive. The head housemaid, Mrs. Cartwright, took me under her wing and taught me everything she knew, impressed by my willingness to work and my quick intelligence. But more than the practical skills, I learned about the world I now inhabited. I learned the names of the flowers in the garden and the titles of the books in the library. I learned which rooms received the morning sun and which were coldest in winter. I learned the history of the Blackwood family, stretching back centuries, a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies woven through the very stones of the manor. And I learned about the Duke. I also learned about the Duke. I learned that he was brilliant and proud and desperately alone. I learned that his father had been a cruel man who believed that affection was a weakness and that a duke must never show his heart to anyone. The old servants whispered about the late Duke's rages, about the beatings he had administered to his sons, about the cold silences that could last for weeks. They spoke of how young Sebastian had borne it all without complaint, had learned to hide his pain behind a mask of perfect courtesy, had retreated so far into himself that no one could reach him. I learned that his mother had died giving birth to his younger brother, Lord Marcus, and that the late Duke had blamed Sebastian for her death, though the boy had been only 6 years old and innocent of any wrongdoing. This made no sense to me at first, until one of the older servants explained that Sebastian had been the one to summon his mother to see a bird's nest he had found in the garden. She had come at his request, had climbed a ladder to see the nest more clearly, and had fallen. The fall had not killed her, but it had brought on the premature labor that took her life. The late Duke had never forgiven Sebastian for this accident, had never allowed him to forget that his mother's death was his fault. I learned that Lord Marcus was nothing like his brother. Where Sebastian was reserved and thoughtful, Marcus was charming and careless. Where Sebastian labored over the estate accounts and worried about the welfare of his tenants, Marcus spent his allowance on gambling and fine clothes, and women whose names he could not remember by morning. Where Sebastian inspired respect, Marcus inspired only a kind of wary fondness, the way one might feel toward a beautiful but unreliable horse. Marcus had been raised differently than Sebastian. The late Duke had doted on his younger son, seeing in him the wife he had lost and forgiving him every fault. Marcus had grown up believing that rules did not apply to him, that consequences were for other people, that his charm would always save him. And for a long time, it had. But charm has a way of wearing thin, especially when it is not backed by substance. I learned all of this, and I kept what I learned locked away in my heart, for it was not my place to speak of such things. I was a servant, and the Duke was my master, and the distance between us was measured not in feet or in rooms, but in centuries of custom and expectation. But I could not stop myself from watching him. I watched him when he walked through the halls, lost in thought, his brow furrowed with concerns I could only imagine. I watched him when he stood at the windows of the library, staring out at the rain, his reflection ghostly in the glass. I watched him when he received guests, his face a mask of courtesy that concealed whatever he truly felt. I watched him when he thought no one was looking, and in those unguarded moments, I saw the weight he carried, the burden of responsibility and loneliness that pressed down upon him like a physical force. And sometimes, rarely, he would catch me watching, and our eyes would meet for a moment before I looked away, my cheeks burning with shame and something else I dared not name. I told myself that it was only gratitude. I told myself that I owed him my life, and that my devotion was nothing more than the natural response of a heart that remembered kindness. I told myself these things because the truth was too dangerous to admit, even in the silence of my own thoughts. The truth was that I loved him. I loved him with a love that had no hope and no future, a love that could only bring me pain. I loved him, and I kept my love secret, and I believed that this was how things would always be. I loved the way he cared for his tenants, visiting them personally when they were sick, ensuring that their cottages were repaired before winter. I loved the way he treated the servants with courtesy, remembering their names and asking after their families. I loved the way his eyes lit up when he discussed philosophy or history, the only times I ever saw the mask slip and the real man emerge. I loved him, and I hated myself for loving him. What right did I have to dream of a duke? What right did a maid, a foundling, a nobody, have to imagine herself worthy of such a man? Society would laugh at the very idea. The other servants would think me mad. And Sebastian himself, if he ever discovered my feelings, would surely be horrified, embarrassed, perhaps even disgusted. So I kept my distance as much as my duties would allow. I performed my work diligently and silently. I did not seek out opportunities to be near him, though such opportunities seemed to find me anyway, and I buried my love so deep within my heart that I could almost pretend it did not exist. Almost. There were moments, brief and precious, when the pretense failed. Moments when our eyes met across a crowded room and something passed between us, something electric and indefinable. Moments when I brought tea to the library and found him there alone, and he would look up from his book and thank me with a warmth that seemed reserved only for me. Moments when I walked past his study and heard him playing the piano, melodies so haunting and beautiful that they brought tears to my eyes. I treasured these moments and feared them in equal measure. They were proof that something existed between us, some connection that defied explanation. But they were also reminders of everything I could never have, everything I could never be. I was wrong about how things would always be. Life has a way of upending our certainties, of forcing us to confront truths we have spent years avoiding. And the truth that came to Ashworth Manor that autumn would change everything. I was wrong. The trouble began with Lord Marcus, as trouble so often did. He had always resented his brother, though he hid it well beneath his easy smile and his generous words. Sebastian had inherited everything, the title, the estate, the fortune, the respect of society. Marcus had inherited only the scraps, a modest allowance, and a lifetime of living in his brother's shadow. I had seen glimpses of this resentment over the years, small moments when the mask slipped, a flash of anger in his eyes when Sebastian was praised, a cutting remark disguised as a jest, a tendency to undermine his brother in subtle ways, spreading gossip or questioning his decisions. But these were minor irritations, nothing that seemed truly dangerous. I did not realize then how deep the poison ran. I did not understand that resentment, left to fester over decades, can transform into something far darker. I did not see that Marcus's charm was merely a prettier form of cruelty, that his smile concealed a heart capable of betrayal. For years, this resentment had simmered quietly, expressed only in small cruelties and petty jealousies. But something changed in the autumn of that 5th year. Marcus fell into debt, deeper than ever before, to men who did not accept excuses or promises. These were not the genteel creditors of the gambling halls, willing to wait for payment and maintain appearances. These were hard men, dangerous men, men who collected what they were owed by any means necessary. He came to Sebastian and begged for help, and Sebastian, who had helped him so many times before, finally refused. I heard their argument, or part of it, from my position in the hallway outside the study. I was not eavesdropping intentionally. I had come to bring fresh candles, and I froze when I heard the raised voices, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. "I cannot do this again," Sebastian said, his voice weary and firm. Every time I pay your debts, you make new ones. Every time I save you from ruin, you find new ways to ruin yourself. I am not your father, Marcus. I cannot spend my life cleaning up after you." The words hung in the air, heavy with exhaustion and disappointment. I could picture Sebastian as he spoke them, standing behind his desk perhaps, his hands pressed flat against the polished wood, his eyes dark with the pain of watching his brother destroy himself. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a bitter, ugly sound. "No, you are not our father. Our father would have let me rot. Our father would have watched me hang and felt nothing but satisfaction." "That is not true," Sebastian replied, and now I heard something else in his voice. Grief, mingled with the weariness. "Despite everything, you were the one he loved. You were always the one he preferred. And yet here we are," Marcus said. "You with everything, me with nothing. Tell me, brother, how does that feel? To have taken everything that should have been shared?" I heard footsteps, and then Sebastian's voice, closer now, as if he had moved toward his brother. "That is not true, and you know it. I have always tried to protect you. I have always done what I could. When father was alive, I shielded you from his rages. When he died, I gave you an allowance larger than he ever would have permitted. I have covered your debts 100 times. I have smoothed over your scandals. What more would you have me do?" "What you could," Marcus repeated, and the contempt in his voice made me shiver. "What you could is never enough, brother. It never has been. It never will be." The door flew open then, and Marcus strode past me without a glance, his face twisted with fury. His eyes were wild, his fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment I saw the truth of him laid bare. Not the charming younger brother, but something darker, something capable of terrible things. I pressed myself against the wall, hoping to be invisible, but Sebastian had followed him to the threshold, and he saw me standing there, my hands clutching the candles I had meant to deliver. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. It was fear, I realized. Not fear of me, but fear of what I might have heard. What I might think of him now that I had witnessed his failure to save his brother from himself. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were holding something back by sheer force of will. "I apologize for the disturbance." I curtsied, because that was what I was supposed to do. "There is nothing to apologize for, Your Grace. I was only bringing candles." He nodded, but he did not move aside to let me enter. Instead, he stood there in the doorway, blocking my path, and I had the strangest sense that he wanted to say something more, something that had nothing to do with candles or disturbances or the argument I had overheard. But he did not say it. He stepped back and gestured for me to enter, and I replaced the candles in their holders with hands that trembled only slightly, and I left the study without another word. That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed and listened to the wind howling outside my window and thought about the look in his eyes. I thought about his loneliness and his weariness and the weight of responsibility that pressed down upon his shoulders. I thought about Marcus and his debts and his resentment, and I thought, with a sense of dread that I could not explain, that something terrible was coming. I was right. The conspiracy was discovered 3 weeks later, but by then it was too late to stop it. Marcus had been plotting with men who had no loyalty to anyone but themselves, men who saw an opportunity to seize power and wealth without earning it. He had promised them favors and positions and shares of the estate. In return, they had promised to help him remove his brother from the picture. I learned later, much later, how carefully Marcus had laid his plans. He had spent months cultivating relationships with unscrupulous men, a corrupt magistrate here, a greedy solicitor there, a handful of witnesses willing to say anything for the right price. He had forged documents that implicated Sebastian in treasonous correspondence with foreign powers. He had fabricated meetings that never took place, conspiracies that existed only in his imagination. The plan was simple and brutal. Sebastian would be accused of treason, of conspiring against the crown. False evidence would be presented, False witnesses would testify, and before anyone could prove his innocence, he would be locked away where no one could reach him. Marcus would step forward as the grieving brother, forced to take on the duties of the dukedom, while Sebastian awaited trial. And the trial, of course, would never come. Sebastian would simply disappear, forgotten in a prison cell, and Marcus would inherit everything. It was a monstrous scheme, cold-blooded and calculating, and it required Marcus to betray the only person who had ever truly loved him. But Marcus, I came to understand, was incapable of seeing it that way. In his mind, he was merely claiming what should have been his all along. In his mind, Sebastian was the thief, and he was simply taking back what had been stolen. I did not know any of this at the time. I only knew that men came to the manor one evening, men in dark coats with cold eyes, and they took Sebastian away. It happened so quickly. One moment, the household was preparing for dinner, the usual quiet bustle of servants moving through the halls. The next moment, there was shouting. The sound of boots on marble, the crash of doors being thrown open. I was in the upstairs corridor when I heard it, and I ran to the landing just in time to see Sebastian being led away in chains. He did not struggle. He did not cry out. He walked with his head held high and his face expressionless, as if this were merely an inconvenience, a minor disruption to his schedule. But I saw his eyes as he passed beneath me, and what I saw there broke my heart. There was no anger in those eyes, no outrage. There was only a terrible, resigned sadness, as if he had always known that this moment would come. I only knew that Marcus stood in the great hall with his face arranged in an expression of shock and sorrow, proclaiming that he could not believe his brother capable of such treachery, that he would do everything in his power to clear Sebastian's name. He played his part well. I will give him that. His voice trembled with emotion. His eyes glistened with tears that might even have been real. He spoke of his love for his brother, of his disbelief that such a thing could happen, of his determination to see justice done. And the servants who gathered to watch, who did not know him as I did, believed every word. But I was not fooled. I saw the satisfaction beneath the sorrow, the triumph hiding behind the tears. I saw the way his hands did not tremble, the way his voice remained steady even as he professed his grief. I saw the truth, and the truth filled me with a fury so intense that I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming. The servants whispered among themselves, and I listened. I listened to stories of hidden documents and secret meetings, of witnesses who swore they had seen Sebastian passing messages to foreign agents. I listened to speculation about what would happen next, whether the Duke would be tried and executed or simply left to rot in some forgotten cell. I listened, and I did not believe a word of it. I had watched Sebastian Blackwood for 5 years. I had seen the way he cared for his tenants, the way he labored over matters of justice and fairness, the way he treated even the lowest servant with courtesy and respect. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence, that he was innocent. I had seen him stay up late into the night reviewing estate accounts, ensuring that every tenant received fair treatment. I had seen him personally visit the sick, bringing medicine and food from his own kitchens. I had seen him argue with his solicitors over harsh terms in contracts, always taking the side of those who could not advocate for themselves. This was not a man capable of treason. This was not a man who would betray his country for any price. But my certainty meant nothing. I was a maid, a nobody, a woman whose word carried no weight in the courts of men. I could not save him with my testimony. I could not save him with my tears. I could only watch as Marcus moved into the master's chambers, as he dismissed the servants who had been loyal to Sebastian, as he began to remake Ashworth Manor in his own image. 3 months passed, 3 months of watching and waiting and praying for news that never came. 3 months of keeping my head down and my mouth shut, of pretending to serve the new master while my heart burned with hatred and grief. Those were the darkest days of my life. I moved through them like a ghost, performing my duties by rote, speaking only when spoken to. The other servants noticed my withdrawal, I think, but they attributed it to the general malaise that had settled over the household. Many of them were grieving too, in their own ways. Sebastian had been a good master, fair and considerate, and his absence left a void that Marcus could not fill. Marcus himself seemed to revel in his new position. He threw lavish parties that Sebastian would never have countenanced. He ordered expensive furnishings and fine wines. He treated the servants with casual contempt, as if we were furniture rather than people. And through it all, he maintained the pretense of the grieving brother, speaking sadly of Sebastian whenever guests inquired, sighing about the terrible burden of managing the estate in such tragic circumstances. I watched him, and I waited, and I planned. I did not know what I was planning for, exactly. I only knew that I could not accept this, could not live out my days serving the man who had destroyed the one I loved. Something would have to change. Something would have to give. And then I learned where they had taken him. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, who told me. She was an old woman who had served the family for decades, and she had no love for Marcus. She had known Sebastian since he was an infant, had watched him grow from a solemn child into a dignified man, and she refused to believe the charges against him. She came to my room one night late, when the house was dark and silent, and the only sounds were the settling of old timbers and the distant cry of owls. I was lying awake as I did most nights, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about Sebastian in some cold cell somewhere. When I heard the soft knock at my door, I assumed it was one of the other maids, perhaps needing help with some late-night task. But when I opened the door, I found Mrs. Pemberton standing there, her face pale and drawn in the flickering candlelight. "May I come in?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that made my heart begin to race. I stepped aside to let her enter, and she closed the door behind her and pressed a folded paper into my hands. "He is in the tower," she whispered. "The old tower on the north end of the estate. They moved him there a fortnight ago, when the prison became too dangerous. Marcus wanted him closer, where he could watch him die slowly." I stared at her, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The tower? I knew the tower. Everyone knew it. It was a crumbling remnant of the original castle that had stood on this land centuries ago, a single stone column rising from the edge of a cliff, surrounded by nothing but rocks and thorns, and a sheer drop to the sea far below. It had not been used for anything in living memory. It was a place for ghosts and ravens, not for living men. "He is alive?" I asked, and my voice came out strange and choked, barely recognizable as my own. Barely. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes were wet with tears, and her hands trembled as she spoke. "They give him bread and water once a day, nothing more. They mean for him to waste away, to die of hunger and despair. And when he is gone, Marcus will announce that he took his own life, unable to bear the shame of his supposed crimes. No one will question it. No one will investigate. And Marcus will have won." The horror of it washed over me in waves. To think of Sebastian, proud and dignified Sebastian, wasting away in that cold tower, forgotten and alone. To think of him dying slowly, day by day, while Marcus celebrated in the halls below. It was unbearable. It was obscene. And it could not be allowed to happen. I looked down at the paper in my hands. It was a rough drawing, showing the tower and its surroundings, with notes scrawled in Mrs. Pemberton's careful handwriting. Guard schedules, patrol routes. The location of a hidden path through the thorns that had not been used in decades. "What is this?" I asked, though I already knew. "It is a chance," she said. "A small one, but a chance nonetheless. The guards are lazy and few. They do not expect anyone to try to reach the tower from the landward side, because everyone knows it cannot be climbed. And there is a way, if one is brave enough and careful enough and desperate enough." I looked at her. this old woman who had risked everything to bring me this information, and I understood what she was asking of me. "Why me?" I said. "Why not go yourself, or send one of the footmen, or anyone else?" She smiled, a sad and knowing smile that seemed to hold all the wisdom of her many years. "Because you love him. I have seen it in your eyes for years, though you have tried to hide it. And because love is the only force strong enough to make a person do impossible things. I could not deny it. I did not try. I simply folded the paper and tucked it into my bodice, close to my heart, and I thanked her, and I began to plan. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I moved through my duties in a daze, my mind consumed by calculations and preparations. I gathered what I would need: rope, stolen from the stables in small lengths that I braided together in my room after the household slept; a knife, taken from the kitchen and hidden in my stocking; food, saved from my own meager portions and wrapped in cloth; a dark cloak that would help me disappear into the shadows. I memorized Mrs. Pemberton's map until I could see it with my eyes closed. I watched the moon and calculated when it would be darkest, when the clouds would cover the stars and give me the cover I needed. I also prepared myself mentally for what I was about to do. I knew that if I was caught, I would be hanged. Helping a prisoner escape was a capital offense, and Marcus would show no mercy to anyone who tried to thwart his plans. I knew that even if I succeeded in reaching the tower, I might find Sebastian already dead. I knew that the climb itself might kill me, that one slip could send me tumbling into the darkness below. But I did not waver. Fear was there, certainly, a cold knot in my stomach that tightened with every passing hour. But stronger than the fear was something else, a certainty that I was doing the right thing, that I was meant for this moment, that my entire life had been leading to this one desperate act of love. And on the 4th night, when the household slept, and the guards made their rounds, and Marcus drank himself to stupor in the master's study, I slipped out of the servants' entrance and began to walk. The night was cold and dark, with clouds covering the stars, and a wind that cut through my cloak like a knife. I moved silently across the grounds, keeping to the shadows, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain the guards would hear it. But the guards were lazy, as Mrs. Pemberton had promised. They huddled around their fires, passing a bottle between them, complaining about the cold and the tedium of their duty. They did not expect trouble. They did not look for it. I reached the edge of the thorns without incident and paused to catch my breath. The thorn bushes stretched before me, a dense and impenetrable barrier that would have stopped any ordinary intruder. But Mrs. Pemberton's map showed a path, a narrow gap in the thorns that had been used centuries ago by smugglers and later forgotten. I found the entrance after several minutes of searching, a dark opening barely visible among the tangled branches. The path through the thorns was worse than I had imagined. The briars tore at my clothes and my skin, drawing blood from my hands and my face and my legs. The ground was uneven and treacherous, full of hidden rocks and sudden drops that threatened to send me tumbling into the darkness. Twice I lost my way and had to backtrack, consulting the map by the faint light of a single candle that I shielded with my cupped hands. Twice I heard the distant voices of guards and pressed myself flat against the cold earth, hardly daring to breathe. The thorns seemed to go on forever. Every step was a battle, a negotiation between my body and the cruel branches that sought to hold me back. My hands were soon slick with blood, and my dress was torn in a dozen places. The pain was constant, 1,000 tiny cuts that burned with every movement. But I did not stop. I could not stop. Every step brought me closer to him, to the man who had saved my life without knowing that he was saving anything at all. Every step was a prayer, a promise, a declaration of the love I had never spoken aloud. The tower loomed before me, black against the slightly less black sky, and I felt my courage falter for the first time. It was taller than I remembered, taller than it had seemed from the safety of the manor. The walls were sheer and smooth, worn by centuries of wind and rain. There were no handholds, no footholds, nothing but cold stone rising toward a narrow window far above. I stood at the base of the tower and looked up, and for a terrible moment, I doubted myself. What was I doing here? What made me think I could climb this impossible wall? I was a maid, not an acrobat. I had never climbed anything more challenging than a ladder. The very idea was madness, and yet here I was, standing in the darkness with blood on my hands and hope in my heart. But there was one thing that the builders of the tower had not anticipated. Along the eastern face, where the stone met the cliff, there was a crack. It was barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through, a jagged line running from the base of the tower to a point perhaps 20 feet above the ground. And from that point, there were stones that jutted out, irregular and weathered, but solid enough to bear the weight of a determined woman. I had studied this crack from a distance, through the old telescope that Sebastian kept in his study. I had measured it with my eyes and calculated whether it could be climbed. I had concluded that it was possible, barely possible, if one was light and strong and not afraid of falling. I was afraid of falling. I was afraid of the darkness and the height and the cold wind that tugged at my cloak as if trying to pull me backward, away from the tower, away from Sebastian. I was afraid of what I would find when I reached the top, whether Sebastian would still be alive, whether he would recognize me, whether all of this would be for nothing. But I climbed anyway. What choice did I have? To turn back now would be to condemn him to death. To give in to fear would be to betray everything I believed, everything I was. The first part was the worst. I wedged myself into the crack and inched upward, my back pressed against one wall and my feet braced against the other. The stone scraped against my skin and tore at my dress. My muscles burned with the effort, screaming protests that I ignored. My breath came in ragged gasps that I tried to muffle against my sleeve. The crack was narrow and unforgiving, and there were moments when I was certain I would become stuck, trapped between the stones like an insect in amber. But inch by inch, I rose. I focused on the next movement, the next breath, refusing to think about how far I had come or how far I had yet to go. I let the pain become a kind of meditation, a rhythm that carried me upward. My world shrank to the feel of stone against my body, the sound of my own heartbeat, the single imperative to keep moving. And then I reached the jutting stones, and I pulled myself out of the crack and onto the first one. And I looked up and saw that the window was still so far above me. The second part of the climb was different, but no less terrifying. The stones jutted out at irregular intervals, some barely wide enough to support a foot, others smooth and slippery with moisture. I tested each one before trusting it with my weight, knowing that a single mistake would send me plummeting to my death. The wind seemed stronger now, tugging at my clothes and my hair, trying to pry me loose from my precarious holds. I do not know how long it took me to reach it. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the stone beneath my fingers, the wind at my back, the endless darkness below. There was only the next handhold and the next foothold, and the knowledge that if I fell, I would die. And Sebastian would die too, and Marcus would win. At some point, I began to talk to myself. A constant stream of encouragement whispered under my breath. "You can do this," I told myself. "One more stone. One more reach. You are almost there. You are strong. You are brave. You love him, and love is stronger than fear, stronger than stone, stronger than anything." But I did not fall. I climbed, and I climbed, and I climbed, and finally my fingers closed around the edge of the window, and I pulled myself up and over and tumbled into the room beyond. I lay there for a moment, gasping, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The room was dark, lit only by a sliver of moonlight that had found its way through the clouds. It smelled of damp stone and unwashed flesh and despair. And then I heard a voice, weak and hoarse, and barely recognizable, but unmistakably his. "Who is there?" I pushed myself up onto my knees and crawled toward the sound. He was in the corner, chained to the wall by a length of iron links that clanked as he moved. I could barely see him in the darkness, but I could make out the outline of his body, thinner than I remembered, hunched against the cold stone. "It is Clara," I said. "Clara Whitmore. Your Grace, I have come to take you away from this place." For a long moment he did not respond. I wondered if he had understood me, if his mind had been broken by months of isolation and suffering. But then he laughed, a terrible, broken sound that cut through me like a knife. "Clara." His voice was wondering, disbelieving. The maid with the watchful eyes. "Have I finally gone mad then? Are you a phantom come to torment me in my last hours?" I crawled closer, close enough to touch him, and I reached out and took his hand in mine. His skin was cold and rough, and I could feel the bones beneath the flesh, but he was real, he was alive, and that was all that mattered. "I am no phantom," I said. "I am here. I am real. And I am going to save you, if you will let me." He gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me, and I heard his breath catch in his throat. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you risk everything for me? You owe me nothing. You should have fled this place months ago, should have found somewhere safe and forgotten that Ashworth Manor ever existed." I knew that I should not say it. I knew that the words would change everything, would create a complication that could never be undone. But I had climbed a tower for him. I had risked my life for him. I had nothing left to lose, and so I told him the truth. "Because I love you," I said. "I have loved you since the day you carried me out of the garden. I have loved you every day since, though I knew I had no right to love you, though I knew you could never love me in return. I love you, and I would rather die trying to save you than live a single day in a world where you are gone." The silence stretched between us, heavy and trembling. I could not see his face, could not read his expression. I waited for him to laugh at me, to dismiss my confession as the foolish fantasy of a low-born woman who had forgotten her place. But he did not laugh. Instead, he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against my fingers, gentle and reverent, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Clara," he said my name like a prayer, like a promise. "I have thought of you every day in this darkness. I have held onto the memory of your face like a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood. I told myself that I had no right to think of you that way, that you deserved someone who could give you the life you merited. But I was lying to myself. The truth is that I have loved you too. I have loved you for longer than I knew, and I was too proud and too afraid to admit it." I felt tears streaming down my face, warm against my cold cheeks. We remained there for a moment, our hands clasped together, two people who had found each other in the darkness against all odds. But there was no time for more. The guards would make their rounds soon, and we needed to be gone before they discovered that the Duke was no longer alone in his prison. I pulled out the knife I had brought and set to work on the lock that held his chains. It was old and rusted, and the blade was not designed for such work, but desperation lent me skill. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open and the chains fell away. "Can you walk?" I asked. He tried to stand and nearly fell. I caught him, wrapping his arm around my shoulders and bracing myself to take his weight. He was taller than me by nearly a foot, and even diminished by months of captivity, he was heavy. But I would carry him out of this tower if I had to. I would carry him to the ends of the earth. "The window," I said. "We have to go back the way I came." He looked at the narrow opening, then down at the sheer drop beyond it, and I saw something flicker across his face. Fear, perhaps, or doubt. But he nodded, and he did not argue. Going down was harder than going up. I went first, showing him where to place his hands and feet, calling instructions up to him in a voice barely louder than a whisper. He was weak and unsteady, but he was determined. And step by step, inch by inch, we descended. We were halfway down when I heard the shout. "The prisoner has escaped. Check the tower! Check everything!" Torches appeared in the darkness, distant but moving closer. I heard the baying of dogs and the pounding of boots on stone. They had discovered his absence. They were coming. "Faster!" I hissed. "We have to go faster!" We abandoned caution and descended recklessly, scraping our hands and our knees on the rough stone. Sebastian slipped twice, and each time I thought my heart would stop, but each time he caught himself and continued downward. We reached the ground just as the first torchlight rounded the corner of the tower. I pulled Sebastian into the crack in the wall, the same crack I had used to begin my ascent, and we pressed ourselves into the shadows as the guards rushed past. They did not see us. They did not think to look in the crack, so focused were they on the path that led away from the tower. We heard them shouting orders, splitting up to search the grounds, and we waited until their voices faded into the distance before we dared to move. "This way," I whispered, and I led him through the thorns. The path back was worse than the path there. Sebastian could barely walk, and I had to half carry him through the brambles, which tore at us both without mercy. Every step was agony. Every moment I expected to hear the guards behind us, to feel their hands closing around my arms. But we made it. We emerged from the thorns at the edge of the estate, where the land sloped down toward a road that led away from Ashworth and toward freedom. There was a cart waiting there, arranged by Mrs. Pemberton. The driver was a tenant farmer who owed Sebastian his livelihood and who had agreed to help without asking any questions. He saw us emerge from the darkness, two figures stumbling and bleeding, and he jumped down from his seat and helped me lift Sebastian into the back of the cart. "Where to?" he asked. "London," I said. I had friends there, servants who had left Ashworth over the years and who might be willing to shelter us. It was a risk, but it was the only plan I had. The cart jolted into motion, and I sat in the back with Sebastian's head in my lap, stroking his hair as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The stars wheeled overhead, and the miles fell away behind us, and with every passing hour, I dared to hope that we might actually survive. We reached London 3 days later, exhausted and starving but alive. The journey had been harrowing, a constant fear of discovery lurking behind every mile. We traveled by night when we could, hiding in barns and abandoned cottages during the day. Every distant shout made my heart stop. Every passing rider made me fear that Marcus had sent men to hunt us down. But we were not discovered. The cart brought us to the outskirts of the city, where the tenant farmer bid us farewell with tears in his eyes and a blessing on his lips. From there, we walked, Sebastian leaning heavily on my shoulder through the winding streets of London until we reached the bakery where my friends lived. My friends took us in without hesitation, asking no questions, demanding no explanations. They were good people, former servants like myself, who had left Ashworth Manor over the years to build their own lives. They saw the state we were in, saw the desperation in my eyes and the weakness in Sebastian's limbs, and they simply opened their door and gestured for us to enter. They hid us in a cramped attic room above a bakery in one of the poorer quarters of the city. It was small and dusty, with a single window that looked out over a maze of rooftops. The ceiling was so low that Sebastian could not stand fully upright. The only furniture was a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. It was not much, but it was safe, and for the moment, that was all that mattered. Sebastian was very ill. The months of captivity had weakened him terribly, had stripped away the strength and vitality that I remembered. His body was a map of suffering, thin and pale, and marked with bruises that had not yet faded. The journey had taken what little strength remained, and by the time we reached the attic room, he could barely keep his eyes open. The first night, I truly feared he would die. His fever spiked so high that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, even from across the room. He thrashed and moaned, lost in nightmares that I could not reach, calling out names and words that made no sense. I sat beside him all night, bathing his forehead with cool water, whispering prayers I had not spoken since childhood. I nursed him through fevered nights and endless days, spooning broth between his cracked lips and bathing his forehead with cool water. I did not sleep, or if I did, it was only in brief snatches while sitting in the chair beside his bed. I did not eat, or if I did, I cannot remember it. I did not leave his side, not even for a moment. The thought that he might wake and find himself alone, might think himself abandoned again, was more than I could bear. My friends brought food and medicine, fresh water and clean linens. They asked no questions about who Sebastian was or why we were hiding. They simply helped, with a generosity that still brings tears to my eyes when I remember it. The baker's wife made a special broth that she swore could cure anything, and perhaps it could, because slowly, day by day, Sebastian began to improve. On the 5th day, his fever broke. I knew the moment it happened because his face, which had been flushed and contorted with pain, suddenly relaxed into an expression of peace. His breathing, which had been ragged and labored, grew slow and steady. And when he opened his eyes and looked at me, there was clarity in his gaze for the first time since we had fled the tower. "You saved me," he said. His voice was still weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was his voice again. The voice I had memorized over 5 years of secret longing. "You saved me first," I replied. I was only returning the favor. He reached up and touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my cheekbone. I was a mess, I knew. I had not bathed in days. My hair was tangled and my dress was torn, and my hands were scarred from the climb. But he looked at me as if I were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I meant what I said in the tower," he told me. "I love you, Clara. I have loved you for years, though I was too foolish to admit it. When I thought I was going to die in that place, the only thing I regretted was that I had never told you the truth." I bent down and kissed him gently, on the lips. It was the first kiss I had ever given, and it tasted of tears and hope and the promise of everything we had almost lost. "I love you too," I whispered against his mouth. "I always have. I always will." We held each other for a long time after that, two broken people finding comfort in each other's arms. The attic room, which had seemed so cramped and cheerless before, now felt like a sanctuary. The narrow bed, which had been a place of fear and fevered nightmares, now felt like a haven. Everything had changed with those 3 words, with that single kiss. The future, which had seemed so uncertain and terrifying, now glowed with possibility. But even as I said the words, even as I reveled in the miracle of his love, I knew that our trials were not over. Marcus was still out there, still in control of Ashworth, still spreading lies about Sebastian's supposed crimes. We were fugitives, hiding in an attic, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the determination in our hearts. The charges against Sebastian had not been dropped. In the eyes of the law, he was still a traitor, an enemy of the crown. If we were discovered, he would be dragged back to prison, and this time, there would be no escape. And I would be hanged for helping him, my body displayed as a warning to others who might think of defying the authority of the state. We would have to fight. We would have to expose Marcus for what he was, and clear Sebastian's name and reclaim everything that had been stolen from him. It would be dangerous and difficult, and there was no guarantee of success. We had no money, no resources, no powerful friends. All we had was each other and the truth. But we would do it together. That was what mattered. We had found each other against all odds, and we would face whatever came next side by side. I had climbed a tower for him. I had faced death for him. What was one more battle when the prize was our freedom and our future? The weeks that followed were a blur of planning and preparation. Sebastian grew stronger every day, his body slowly recovering from the damage that had been done to it. Color returned to his cheeks. Strength returned to his limbs. The haunted look in his eyes gave way to something fiercer, a determination that matched my own. We spent our evenings in the attic room. By the light of a single candle, poring over everything we knew about Marcus and his conspiracy. We made lists and drew diagrams. We identified the weak points in Marcus's armor, the places where his lies might be exposed. We argued and debated and refined our plans until they were as sharp and deadly as blades. There were allies, we discovered. Sebastian had friends in London, men of influence who had never believed the charges against him and who were willing to help if given proof of his innocence. There were also enemies, men who had thrown in their lot with Marcus and who would stop at nothing to see Sebastian destroyed. But the most important ally was one we had not expected. Her name was Lady Constance Ashford, and she was the daughter of an earl and one of the most powerful women in London society. She was also, as it turned out, one of Marcus's victims. I had heard of Lady Constance before, of course. Every servant in every great house knew the names of the most prominent figures in society, knew who was courting whom, who had fallen from favor, who was rising. Lady Constance was known for her beauty and her intelligence, for her sharp wit and her charitable works. She was the kind of woman who could have had any man she wanted, and yet she remained unmarried at 27, a fact that had generated endless speculation among the gossips of the ton. Now I understood why. She came to us one evening, cloaked and veiled, having tracked us down through a series of intermediaries that I never fully understood. The knock at our door came after midnight, and I opened it with my heart pounding, expecting guards or soldiers. Instead, I found a tall woman in a dark cloak, her face hidden beneath a veil of black lace. "May I come in?" she asked, and her voice was low and cultured, the voice of a woman born to privilege. "I have information that may help the Duke." I looked at Sebastian, who had risen from his chair by the fire, and he nodded. I stepped aside to let her enter. She sat in our cramped attic room on a stool that creaked beneath even her slight weight, and she removed her veil to reveal a face of striking beauty marred by exhaustion and fear. Her eyes were dark and haunted, the eyes of someone who had carried a secret for too long. And then she told us her story, and it was a story that made my blood boil with anger. Marcus had courted her the previous season, showering her with attention and promises. He had been charming and attentive, seemingly everything a woman could want in a suitor. He had brought her flowers and written her poetry. He had danced with her at every ball, had sat beside her at every dinner, had made her feel as if she were the only woman in the world. "I was a fool," Lady Constance said, and her voice trembled with self-recrimination. "I should have seen through him. Everyone warned me that the Blackwood brothers were different, that the younger one was not to be trusted. But I was dazzled by his attention. I was flattered that such a handsome, titled man would pursue me with such devotion, and I came dangerously close to accepting his proposal of marriage. But at the last moment, she had discovered the truth about him, that he was deeply in debt, deeper than anyone knew, to men who would stop at nothing to collect what they were owed. She had discovered that he intended to use her fortune to pay off his creditors, that once her money was in his hands, he would discard her as carelessly as he had discarded every other woman who had ever cared for him. She had discovered that he had no genuine affection for her at all, that every tender word had been a lie, every loving gesture a performance. "I confronted him," she said. "I told him that I knew the truth and that I would never marry him. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought he would simply move on to another victim. But I underestimated how dangerous he could be. She had refused him, and he had responded with threats. He had letters, he told her. Letters that she had written to him during their courtship. Letters that could be interpreted in ways that would destroy her reputation. They were innocent letters, expressions of affection and hope that any woman might write to a man she believed loved her. But in Marcus's hands, they could be made to seem like something else entirely. If she did not keep silent about what she knew, he would release them to the scandal sheets and ruin her forever. "I was terrified," Lady Constance admitted. "My father would have been devastated. My family would have been destroyed. And so I kept silent. I watched Marcus continue his schemes, watched him destroy other people's lives, and I said nothing. I told myself that there was nothing I could do, that speaking out would only harm myself without helping anyone else. She had kept silent, terrified and ashamed, while Marcus's crimes continued. She had heard about Sebastian's arrest and believed the charges, because what else could she believe? She had no way of knowing that Marcus was capable of framing his own brother. But then she had heard rumors that Sebastian had escaped from his imprisonment, that he was somewhere in London and planning to expose his brother for what he truly was. And she knew that she had to act. "I can testify," she said, and now her voice was stronger, filled with a determination that had replaced the fear. "I can tell the world what Marcus truly is. I have other evidence too, documents I managed to obtain before I broke with him, documents that prove he forged the evidence against the Duke. I was too afraid to use them before. I was a coward. But I am not afraid anymore. I will not let my fear protect him any longer." She reached into her cloak and produced a leather satchel, worn and stained but carefully preserved. Inside were letters and ledgers, receipts and records, a damning collection of evidence that proved Marcus's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. There were letters in Marcus's own hand discussing the conspiracy, payments to the men who had testified against Sebastian, drafts of the forged documents that had been used to accuse him of treason. "Where did you get these?" Sebastian asked, his voice filled with wonder. "I took them from his study," Lady Constance replied. "The night I refused his proposal, after he threatened me, I went to his rooms and I searched until I found them. I did not know what they were at the time. I only knew that if he had secrets, I wanted to know them. I have kept them hidden ever since, waiting for a moment when they might be useful. And now that moment has come." Sebastian took her hand and thanked her, his voice thick with emotion. I saw tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and gratitude, and the release of a burden she had carried for far too long. "You have nothing to thank me for," she said. "I should have come forward sooner. I should have been braver. Perhaps if I had spoken out when I first learned the truth, none of this would have happened. Your Grace would never have been imprisoned. You would never have suffered as you did." Sebastian shook his head. "You came forward now. That is what matters. And I will never forget what you have risked to help me." Lady Constance stayed with us for several hours that night, going through the documents and explaining their significance. By the time she left, just before dawn, we had everything we needed to destroy Marcus completely. With Lady Constance's help, we built our case. Sebastian's friends in Parliament agreed to hear the evidence. The documents were authenticated by experts who swore before magistrates that the papers were genuine. Witnesses came forward, servants and clerks and minor officials who had seen things they should not have seen and who were finally willing to speak now that they knew they would not stand alone. The weeks of preparation were exhausting but exhilarating. For the first time since Sebastian's arrest, I dared to believe that we might actually succeed. Every day brought new evidence, new allies, new reasons for hope. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and Marcus did not even know it. I often wondered what he was doing during those weeks, whether he had any inkling that his carefully constructed empire of lies was about to come crashing down. I imagined him in the great hall at Ashworth, drinking Sebastian's wine and sitting in Sebastian's chair, secure in the belief that he had won. The thought filled me with a grim satisfaction. He would learn soon enough how wrong he had been. The confrontation came on a cold morning in early spring, in the great hall of the House of Lords. The chamber was packed with peers and ministers, with journalists and curious onlookers who had heard rumors that something momentous was about to happen. The air hummed with anticipation and barely suppressed excitement. Sebastian stood before the assembled peers, thin and pale but unbowed. The months of captivity had left their mark on him, had carved new lines into his face and threaded silver through his dark hair. But his eyes were clear and his voice was strong, and he commanded the attention of every person in that vast chamber simply by existing. He told his story from the beginning, leaving nothing out. He told them about his brother's debts and his brother's schemes, about the slow poison of jealousy that had corrupted Marcus's heart. He told them about the forged documents and the bribed witnesses, about the men in dark coats who had come to arrest him on false charges. He told them about the tower and the chains and the months of darkness and despair, about the cold and the hunger and the crushing loneliness of knowing that he had been abandoned by everyone. His voice never wavered, even when he described the worst of what he had endured. He spoke with the quiet dignity of a man who had looked into the abyss and emerged somehow stronger. And the peers listened, their faces growing more horrified with every word. And when he was finished, Lady Constance rose and corroborated everything he had said. She was magnificent that day, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk, her voice ringing through the chamber like a bell. She produced her documents, her letters, her evidence. She named names and cited dates and laid bare the whole rotten conspiracy for everyone to see. The chamber erupted into chaos. Men shouted and argued, some defending Marcus even now, others demanding his immediate arrest. The Lord Chancellor had to call for order multiple times before the noise subsided. And through it all, I stood in the gallery above, watching with tears streaming down my face. We had done it. Against all odds, we had exposed the truth. Marcus was arrested that same day. He tried to flee when he learned what had happened, had been halfway to the docks when the authorities caught up with him. I did not witness his capture, but I heard about it later, how he screamed and cursed and proclaimed his innocence, how he blamed everyone but himself for his downfall, how he was dragged away in chains to face the justice he had tried so hard to escape. He saw me one time after his arrest, when he was being led from the holding cell to his trial. Our eyes met across the crowded corridor, and I saw in his gaze a hatred so pure and absolute that it made my blood run cold. He did not say a word, but his expression spoke volumes. He blamed me for his fall. He would have destroyed me if he could, but he could do nothing. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and even his most loyal supporters had abandoned him. The man who had schemed and manipulated and betrayed his way to power was now utterly alone. The trial was swift and merciless. Marcus was convicted of treason, fraud, and conspiracy, of bearing false witness against his own brother, of attempted murder through imprisonment and starvation. His punishment was exile, a lifetime banishment to a distant colony from which he would never return. Some said it was too lenient, that he deserved the noose for what he had done. Others said it was fitting, that he would spend the rest of his days knowing that he had lost everything he had schemed to gain, that he would never again see the manor he had coveted or the society he had tried to deceive. I did not care about Marcus. I had no more room in my heart for hatred or anger. All I cared about was Sebastian, who was finally free, finally vindicated, finally able to reclaim his name and his home and his life. We returned to Ashworth Manor in the late spring, when the roses were blooming in the garden where I had nearly died all those years ago. The journey back was nothing like our desperate flight to London. We traveled in Sebastian's own carriage, restored to him along with everything else Marcus had stolen. We stopped at inns where we were welcomed with bows and curtsies, where people who had once believed the lies about Sebastian now rushed to show their loyalty. The manor itself had suffered during Marcus's brief reign. He had sold some of the furnishings to pay his debts, had let the gardens grow wild, and the repairs go unmade. But the damage was not irreparable. The household had been restored, the servants who had been dismissed brought back, and slowly, day by day, Ashworth Manor began to reclaim its former glory. I threw myself into the work of restoration with a fervor that surprised even me. I directed the cleaning and the repairs, consulted with gardeners about the roses, helped choose new furnishings to replace what had been lost. It was strange to give orders instead of taking them, to be consulted instead of commanded. But the servants seemed to accept my new role without question. They had seen me care for Sebastian in his illness, had heard the story of how I had climbed the tower to save him. In their eyes, I had earned the right to stand beside him. And on a warm evening in June, with the sun setting over the moors and the birds singing in the trees, Sebastian asked me to marry him. We were standing in the garden near the spot where he had found me collapsed and starving so many years ago. The roses were in full bloom around us, their scent heavy and sweet in the evening air. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink and purple, a masterpiece that no human artist could have matched. Sebastian took my hands in his and looked into my eyes, and I saw there a vulnerability that he had never shown to anyone else. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Clara," he began, and then he paused, as if gathering his courage. "I have wanted to say this for so long, have imagined this moment 1,000 times. But now that it is here, I find that words are inadequate." I waited, my heart pounding, hardly daring to breathe. "I know that this is not what society expects," he continued. "I know that there will be whispers and scandals and people who will never accept you as my duchess. They will say that I have forgotten my station, that I have brought shame upon my family name. They will close their doors to us and speak ill of us behind our backs." I started to speak, to tell him that I did not care what society thought, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I need to say this. I need you to understand." He took a deep breath and continued. "But I do not care about society. I do not care about expectations. I do not care about the opinions of people who have never known hardship, who have never had to fight for anything, who have never felt their world crumble around them. I care only about you, Clara. You are the bravest and kindest and most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You climbed a wall to save me. You risked everything for me. You nursed me back to health when I was dying. You stood by me when everyone else had given up." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his grip on my hands tightened. "I have spent my whole life being told that love is weakness, that a duke must put duty before feeling, that the heart must always submit to the head. My father believed this, society believes this, and for many years I believed it too. But you have taught me otherwise. You have shown me that love is not weakness, but strength, the greatest strength there is. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of your love. Will you marry me?" I said yes. Of course I said yes. The word burst from me before I had even finished thinking it, propelled by a joy so intense that it felt like it might lift me off the ground. I had loved him for so long, had dreamed of this moment in secret and silence, never believing it could actually come true. And now it was true, and he was holding me in his arms, and the future stretched out before us like a path of golden light. He kissed me then, there in the garden among the roses, and I tasted tears on his lips, though whether they were his or mine I could not say. The birds sang above us, and the sun sank slowly toward the horizon, and for a perfect, crystalline moment, the whole world was reduced to the two of us, bound together by a love that had survived betrayal and imprisonment and despair. We were married in the chapel at Ashworth, in a ceremony attended by everyone who had helped us along the way. Mrs. Pemberton wept with joy throughout the service, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had belonged to Sebastian's mother. Lady Constance stood as my witness, resplendent in a gown of pale green silk, her face alight with the happiness of someone who has finally found peace. The tenant farmer who had driven us to London sat in the back pew, beaming with pride, his weathered hands folded in his lap. I wore a gown of ivory silk, made by the finest dressmaker in London, with pearls sewn into the bodice and lace at the sleeves. It was finer than anything I had ever worn, finer than anything I had ever imagined wearing. But when I looked at myself in the mirror that morning, I did not see a servant girl playing dress-up. I saw a woman who had earned her place, who had fought for her happiness, who deserved every bit of the joy that awaited her. Sebastian wore his finest coat, dark blue velvet with silver buttons, and when he saw me walking toward him down the aisle of the chapel, his face transformed with an emotion so raw and beautiful that it took my breath away. He looked at me as if I were the sun and the moon and every star in the sky, as if the entire universe had been created just so this moment could exist. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the cheering could be heard all the way to the village. The servants had gathered outside the chapel, unable to fit inside, but unwilling to miss the occasion. They threw flowers as we emerged, a shower of petals that settled on our hair and our clothes like a blessing from heaven. That night, as we stood on the balcony of the master bedroom and looked out at the stars, Sebastian took my hand and raised it to his lips. "I never believed I could be happy," he said quietly. "I never believed I deserved to be loved. But you have taught me otherwise, Clara. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted, and I will spend every day of my life trying to give you the same." I leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart. "You already have," I told him. "You saved me when I had nothing and no one. You gave me a home and a purpose. And now you have given me your heart. What more could I possibly want?" He smiled, that rare and beautiful smile that I had learned to treasure. "Then let us be happy together," he said. "Let us build a life that defies every expectation, every prejudice, every barrier that the world tries to place between us. Let us love each other without reservation and without fear. Let us be simply ourselves." And that is exactly what we did. The years that followed were not always easy. There were challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and periods of struggle. Society did whisper, as Sebastian had predicted. There were doors that remained closed to me, parties to which I was not invited, ladies who looked down their noses at the maid who had dared to become a duchess. I remember the first ball we attended after our marriage, held at the London townhouse of one of Sebastian's friends. The whispers began the moment we entered, a susurrus of shocked commentary that followed us through the room like a shadow. I could feel the weight of 100 disapproving eyes, could sense the judgment in every glance. But Sebastian walked beside me with his head held high, and he introduced me to everyone we encountered, with a pride that left no room for doubt. "This is my wife, the Duchess of Ashworth," he would say, and his voice made it clear that anyone who questioned my worthiness would answer to him. Some people accepted me immediately, recognizing that true nobility lies in character rather than birth. Others took longer to come around, requiring time and repeated exposure before they could see past their prejudices. And some never accepted me at all, maintaining their scorn until the day they died. But I did not let their scorn trouble me. I had Sebastian's love, and I had my own sense of who I was, and that was enough. I learned to move through the world of the aristocracy with grace and dignity, never apologizing for my origins, never pretending to be something I was not. I found that honesty was its own kind of armor, that people respected authenticity even when they could not bring themselves to approve of it. And in time, even the most stubborn of our critics came to respect me, if not to accept me. They saw how I managed the household, how I cared for the tenants, how I supported Sebastian in his duties and responsibilities. They saw that I had not married him for his money or his title, that our love was real and lasting. And though they might never admit it openly, they began to understand that I had earned my place. Sebastian and I grew old together at Ashworth Manor, surrounded by beauty and love and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. We walked in the garden every evening, hand in hand, watching the sun set over the moors. The roses that his mother had planted bloomed year after year, and I tended them with the same care and devotion that I tended our marriage. We read together in the library, sharing books and ideas and the simple pleasure of each other's company. Sebastian taught me philosophy and history, opened my eyes to worlds I had never known existed, and I taught him, in my own way, about resilience and hope, about the strength that comes from knowing you have survived the worst and emerged stronger. We faced our troubles together and celebrated our joys together. And through it all, our love only deepened and grew. It was not a love of grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though we had had our share of those. It was a love of quiet moments and gentle touches, of shared laughter and silent understanding. It was the love of two people who had seen each other at their lowest and their highest, who knew each other's fears and dreams and hopes. I think sometimes about that night in the tower, about the moment when I told Sebastian the truth and he told me the same. I think about how close we came to losing each other, how many things had to go right for us to end up here, together, happy. If Mrs. Pemberton had not been brave enough to bring me the map, if the crack in the tower wall had been a few inches narrower, if Sebastian's strength had failed during the descent, if any of 1,000 variables had been different, our story would have ended in tragedy, but it did not. Against all odds, we found our way to each other, and we built a life that neither of us could have imagined. And I am grateful. Grateful for Mrs. Pemberton's courage and Lady Constance's testimony. Grateful for the crack in the tower wall and the strength in my own hands. Grateful for every twist of fate that led me to that garden so many years ago, starving and desperate and ready to die. But most of all, I am grateful for love. For the love that gave me the courage to climb a wall in the darkness. For the love that brought Sebastian back from the brink of despair. For the love that has sustained us through everything, that continues to sustain us still, that will sustain us until our final breath. I was a maid who fell in love with a duke. He was a prisoner who was saved by a servant. Together, we defied every rule that society tried to impose upon us, and we created something beautiful from the wreckage of tragedy. Our story is not the story that society expected for either of us. It is not the story of a duke marrying a woman of suitable rank and fortune, producing heirs and maintaining appearances. It is not the story of a servant girl knowing her place, working diligently, perhaps marrying a tradesman if she was lucky. It is a different story, a story of love and courage, and the refusal to accept the limitations that others would impose upon us. It is a story that began in a garden with a dying girl and ended here, in this same garden, with an old woman who has known more happiness than she ever dared to dream. This is my story. This is our story. And though it began in darkness and despair, it ends in light and love, exactly as all the best stories do. I am Clara Blackwood, Duchess of Ashworth, and I have no regrets, not one, because every path I walked, every wall I climbed, every risk I took, led me here, to this moment, to this life, to this love. When I close my eyes, I can still feel the cold stone of the tower beneath my fingers. I can still hear the wind howling around me as I climbed, can still taste the fear on my tongue. But I also remember what lay at the top of that climb. Sebastian, waiting in the darkness, believing himself forgotten. Sebastian, who had given me life when I had nothing, and who needed me to give him life in return. I would do it all again, 1,000 times over for him. For Sebastian, for us, forever.